In the Stone Age, there was no such thing as money. Transactions happened through barter between individuals. Civilization came along, and almost immediately Plato banned usury. There must be no lending at interest, he said. The Greeks did begin charging interest, however, at a rate set by the government. When this rate was deregulated, so many Athenians were sold into debt slavery that they threatened revolt. The Bible also forbids usury. The rich ruleth over the poor, and the borrower is slave to the lender. The other main world religions, from Hinduism to Islam and Judaism, also frowned on usurers. In Dante's Inferno, usurers are placed below murderers in the seventh circle of hell. Banks are almost as old as civilization. The first banks stored grain, then soon moved on to precious metals such as gold and silver. Paper money was first introduced as a replacement for gold coins by Kublai Khan in 13th century China. At first, people thought it was a joke because gold and silver had value, whereas paper did not. Kublai was not joking. He decreed that anyone who refused to accept paper money would be executed. Modern banks grew out of 17th century goldsmiths in England, who began lending out some of their gold on deposit. When the Puritans left England and came to the New World, they brought with them the old idea that charging excessive interest was evil. At the founding of the United States, interest rates were capped by law at around 7%, and nobody touched these rules for the next 200 years. Starting in the early 1900s, many states moved their interest rate cap up to 36%, 6 times what it had been for the previous 200 years. In 1978, a few states decided to do away with their usury limits altogether, starting with Delaware and South Dakota. These states quickly became the headquarters of most of the largest financial institutions in the country. Almost immediately, personal bankruptcy shot up. Today, we live at a time when legal interest rates are at their highest point since the invention of banking thousands of years ago.
So what's life like in this deregulated world that we're living in? Let me tell you my story.
It was early in the morning.
In April of 2006, I was caregiving for my grandparents in Moscow, Idaho, and they were both really unsteady on their feet at that point, and so I could only leave for really brief periods of time. I made a run to the co-op, a run to the pharmacy, a couple other small purchases within about a 36-hour period. About 10 days later, I found out that I got overdraft charges for all of those. And the thing that really got to me was that the amount of my purchases was $60 or $70. The amount of my overdraft fees for 4 of them was $140. So the amount of my fees was over double the amount that I had actually spent. That just seemed wrong, you know, it's like kicking you while you were down. So I got mad about it and I started doing some research on the internet. Banks are encouraging customers with low balances to overdraw their checking accounts. The fees are paid disproportionately by low and moderate income people. Borrowers pay triple and even quadruple-digit interest rates. The Federal Reserve Board has acknowledged that overdraft coverage is credit in every sense of the term. Over the past 20 years, the average charge for insufficient funds has quintupled from about $4 to about $20. In 2006, financial institutions earned $53 billion in overdraft fees, a 58% increase from 2001. It's not about customer convenience. It's just a way for banks to make money off customers. That's a quote from the president for retail banking at Commerce Bank. So how much is $53 billion anyway? Well, one piece of financial news that made a lot of headlines was that 2005 was the first year since the Great Depression that Americans had a negative savings rate, meaning they spent more than they earned. $34.8 billion more, which is a lot, but still less than the $53 billion that banks charge in overdraft fees the very next year. For a lot of people who have problems with their banks, their first instinct is to go to a credit union. So I went to talk to Timo, who had worked in credit unions for 17 years, to find out if this is a good option.
The credit union I worked at was the biggest in Oregon, and it, through the time that I worked there, and I worked there 10 years, progressed from having a fairly nominal overdraft
Do you happen
fee.
to remember the number, or you're not sure?
I think it was $8 or $10. Might have been $12.
And what year would that have been, roughly, do you think?
That was 1995.
In 95, $10 or $12. I mean,
Right.
I can verify that, but okay.
Yeah.
And then, do you happen to know what it? I actually called the 800 number the other day, so I know exactly what it is. But do you have any idea?
At the time I left, it was $25
It's 30 now. Yeah. And you left how long ago?
a year ago.
So 1 year. 1 year. What is that? Like a 20% raise in 1 year? Or
Yeah.
something? Okay. Overdraft fees are not the only predatory means that banks use to extract money from their customers. We found a former Wells Fargo employee who had a frightening story to share.
Most of the loans I called on were actually the identical type of loan. It was a $1,000 loan. Basically, the bank would mail, or the financial company would mail, a $1,000 check to the customer, or the future customer. They probably already were a customer somehow, affiliated with the company in another capacity, maybe.
Yeah.
And basically, as soon as someone there signed that check and cashed it, they now had a loan. A very, very high interest $1,000 loan. It seemed like they were like airdropping these things into neighborhoods that they targeted. It really did. And it got to a point, the country was saturated with these loans. And this is $1,000 at a time.
Yeah.
But it became quite clear to me that where these folks lived was really important as to whether or not they would receive this particular type of loan. And they were really so obviously targeting folks who had no other ability to get credit, didn't need credit, couldn't use credit, had no ability to pay it off.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like they knew it going in a way. And
So you're saying that they were definitely targeting poor neighborhoods?
oh yeah.
I'd heard enough. It was time to head back east to find out what people were doing to try to fight back against the banks. My first stop was New York City.
Yeah, I mean, bounce protection is basically one out of a growing array of abusive, high-cost credit practices that we've seen proliferating through low and moderate income neighborhoods in New York and certainly around the country, and also in communities of color at all income levels. So bounce protection is, I would put it on a list with payday loans, tax refund anticipation loans, high-cost abusive credit cards, predatory mortgage loans. And these come in many different forms, but the bottom line is that they target low-income people, they target communities of color, they are a product of this deregulation we were talking about, and they take advantage of, they exploit people who wouldn't otherwise have access to sound, or believe they wouldn't have access to sound forms of credit, fair credit.
Market word, we'll clean up.
Terrific. We'll make millions. I smell trouble. Quiet.
Okay, Sam, it's a deal.
My next stop was an interview in Grand Central Station.
The problem is that many banks, particularly the bigger banks, have figured out ways to change the way that they recognize transactions during the day. And so, for example, most of the big banks will clear the biggest item that comes out in the day. That's probably your mortgage check, might be your life insurance check, something like that. If you had a check that was coming in for deposit and the deposit hadn't cleared yet, you're going to be wiped out right away with that big check. But they say, well, no, that's really a consumer's benefit because they don't want the mortgage check to bounce. Well, very few people actually deliberately bounce the mortgage check because your fine can be from the mortgage company $150. So there's great incentive they usually believe they have the money on hand to pay that, and if they don't, it'll be there the next day. Very rarely do you have anybody really try to kite a mortgage check. But then they clear the rest of the stuff in order of smaller denominations. And the very last transaction might be that $2 bottle of water that you were out jogging and you stop by a convenience store and you pick that up with your signature debit card, and that's the one that nicks you for the $31 late fee. Now, signature debit, more than 50% of the industry's revenue comes from NSF fees, non-sufficient fund events. So that's the bulk of the overdraft fees that are happening now. People still write too many checks and the checks bounce and they get those. But most of the growth is coming from the signature debit.
Okay, so that's $37.50.
When they keep changing the way you do things so that it's easier and easier to get an NSF, Just like it's easier and easier to get a little bit more credit line, it's no different than your corner crack dealer. He's basically offering you a chance to get inducted into a dependency where he's going to make a lot of money off it.
I went to the theater where my friend Mike Daisy was rehearsing his new monologue. I knew he'd have a story to tell.
I moved to Seattle after I graduated from college, and I got like a crappy job, and I lived in a crappy shared house, and I was really living, you know, month to month, and really actually was more like week to week or day to day. Like, money was extremely tight. And I remember when the overdraft fees came in, because I went to my ATM and it's insufficient funds, and I mean, I knew I'd done everything right, you know, because when you're making that little money, you know where everything's going, you know. Even if you blow it on beer or something, you know what you blew on beer. And I go to my bank to find out what's happening. I deposited a check, but they didn't credit me the deposit until after they had put all the checks through that I'd drawn against my account. And so it's one fee after another. And the amount of the fees on the printout I'm looking at is actually more. It's more than I'm going to make this week. It's almost more than I'm going to make this month. I mean, it's impossible. And it's also official, and it's printed right here. I mean, what can I actually say against that? And then the teller says, you know, we do have a solution. You know, they have a linked credit card. They sell you a credit card. The same company, Bank of America, sells you a credit card right then and there when you have overdraft fees, so you can link the credit card in, and then you'll have a way to, you know, take care of these overages. And I remember just feeling like I was caught in a trap, you know, because I was a good, you know, educated, sharp guy. You know, I knew what they were doing to me, you know. They're fucking me. They're fucking me right now. And I didn't feel like I had any choice at all. I remember standing there and filling out the forms right there at the teller station. And that was my very first credit card.
Then it was off to our nation's capital. Surely someone in Washington must be worried about what's going on. You guys consider these fees to not be fees, to actually be loans. So first off, can you tell me, like, what the rationale, why do you consider them to be loans?
At its most basic level, what the bank will do is it is letting you use their money for a certain period of time with the promise that you will pay them back. And that is a loan.
Sounds like a loan.
And how it works is, so let's say you go to a ATM machine, you try to take out $20 and you only have $5 in your account. The bank knows you don't have the amount of money in your account, and they give you the money anyway. And when they give you that money, that $15, they're letting you use it, and you will pay them back the next time you deposit money into your account. And that's exactly the way that a loan works. And on top of it, they charge you a fee for a loan, which is interest. If you take out a $40 overdraft loan at the prevailing overdraft fee now of just over $27, and you paid it back in a week, it would be over 3,500% interest.
Hey, Al, this machine is crooked. You're telling me.
It was time to go see the biggest consumer advocate of them all, to find out what he had to say on the subject. Interest rates have gone up and down over the years for ever since interest rates have existed. And it's only recently that the banks have turned to lower income repeat consumers to kind of fill in the gaps of their income stream. Why now, do you think? Is it happening worse than ever?
Well, it used to be a relationship between a customer and a bank was very personal. Relatively small towns, you knew your banker. As banks got bigger and more impersonal, and as people got drawn into the credit economy, lo and behold, the banks discovered new profit centers, like bounce check fees, like 300 other fees that they charge customers for everything but walking into the bank and wearing on the rug. And so it's all part of losing control of your money through credit cards, through debit cards. Once you lose control of your money, you become very vulnerable to these new fraudulent overcharges that the banks seem to think up by the month.
I bought some shoes, and I knew I didn't have very much money in my account, so before I went out that night and got all crazy, I decided to check online to see how much money I had left. And they had charged me and charged me again, and then credited me. So, but my balance wasn't reflecting the credit, and so I called Wells Fargo, and I was like, what's going on? And the lady said, well, they overcharged you, and then she credited you but it's not showing up yet, which is exactly what I saw. And so I was like, well, so what's going to happen then if I spend more than what it says I have, even though I actually have more? And she said, well, the credit's not going to go through until the morning. So, and I was like, but so if I spend the money and then won't it work out the next day? Won't they see, well, there was the credit and then she spent the money, and so won't it all work out? And she said, I just wouldn't do it. I just wouldn't spend the money. Oh, are you caught? Uh-oh.
Give you my money, honey.
There was a case of a college student in North Carolina earlier this year who was charged a $32 overdraft protection fee because he paid with a debit card and overdrew his account by a nickel. The bank charged him 64,000% interest for his courtesy overdraft. That doesn't come across as very courteous. We see payday lenders marketing themselves as, hey, we're not so bad because look at what a bank is going to charge you for overdraft protection fees. When a payday lender can characterize his product, often legitimately, as a comparative bargain, the loan product with which it's being compared must be a very nasty one indeed.
As you've probably noticed, the consumer advocates that I talk to keep calling these overdraft fees loans, whereas the banks call them fees. Now this is important because if they are in fact loans, that means that you can calculate the APR on these loans, which, as we've just heard, can get pretty ridiculously high. So who's right? Check out this warning that I just found on the internet. Avoid using these plans as short-term loans. They are costly forms of credit. Looks like something one of those bleeding heart consumer advocates would have written, doesn't it? Not this time. Look at who's giving us this warning. The Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. If even the Federal Reserve is calling overdraft fees loans, I think it's time to start calculating those APRs.
Overdraft protection falls much more heavily on lower income people, on students, on seniors, on people who don't have a sizable cushion in their bank account. By definition, they're overdrawing. So the people most likely to overdraw are the people who are the sort of profit base for the banks that offer this product.
Sad.
Sad, but I mean, I think that's the way of the world right now. I mean, I think that banks have basically enjoyed systematic deregulation by state and federal regulators over the last 20 years, and it's partly why we have this colossal feeding frenzy that we're in the middle of and this mess and lack of accountability. What we've seen is that lenders are not making their money off of lending, out of interest rates. Interest rates have gone down so much over the last decade that they're really finding out, sort of carving new ways to generate profits, and it's being made in record numbers through fees. And in fact, banks are not hurting at all. Banks continue to post record profits. Their CEOs are making unprecedented levels of pay. They're not hurting. And yet we keep, through Congress and our state legislatures, removing all sorts of consumer protections under the sort of rubric of relieving regulatory burden. And we have to ask here, what kind of country do we want to live in where these gigantic corporations that are doing really well are not impeded in terms of their, ripping people off and certainly sustaining themselves financially, can just run roughshod over communities and low-income people, and it's really systematic.
Electronic check processing, of which Check 21 is part, but not all, is really speeding up how fast money leaves our accounts. It's leaving our accounts 24/7, but check holds are governed by a different law that hasn't been updated in 17 years. And that means that your bank can make you wait for the money you deposit 2 business days for local checks and 5 business days for non-local checks. Let's put this in context. If you put your paycheck in on Friday night and it's non-local, that means you're waiting until not the next Monday, but the Monday after. Weekends don't count. The day you put it in doesn't count. That's a very long wait for your own money. Many of the abusive practices and fees are pioneered against low-income consumers, and if they are successful from the bank's point of view there, they make money, they'll move them up into the middle class. So I think in some ways the banks, they were so successful at ripping off poor people, now they're moving into ripping off the middle class. And middle class people vote and they talk about the issues, and we all need to do that.
I think I remember one time maybe in the early to mid 90s where it was like, I've got like 7 of these overdraft charges. And they said, yeah, we'll wipe off all but one. Like, no problem. And from what I understand, that doesn't really happen anymore. Do you know why?
There was a distinct change in policy when I was working there. When I first started there, the phone representatives had some amount of leniency. They could refund, say, 2 NSF fees.
Yeah.
I mean, essentially there was a decision made by the management team that there would be no refunds given unless the fee was as a result of an error on the credit union's part.
So do you think that that was in response to what the general banking industry was doing at that time? Do you think it was an overall shift?
Well, there definitely was a trend in the overall banking industry. I mean, essentially, the overall trend was toward generating income through fees. It's easier to grow that source of income, especially if you start with fairly reasonable fees. It's harder to double your loan portfolio in a year, but you can double your overdraft fee overnight.
Banks, quickly figured out that there was a market out there for people who were struggling from paycheck to paycheck, and they saw as a model the payday lending industry, which has grown dramatically over the last few years, and itself charges hundreds and hundreds of % interest, and also has a problem where once you're in a payday loan, you're trapped in the cycle of debt, and you have to flip it over and over again. Yeah. Banks could do 2 things. One, they could compete with their cheap, affordable line of credit product that would really help people get out of financial trouble. Or they could compete on the same terms as the payday lenders and offer their own version of a predatory loan at hundreds of % interest that traps you in debt. And what banks decided to do is that they took a big look at that market share and all the money the payday lenders were making, and they said, we want to compete on their terms. So why is it overdraft fees this time as opposed to something else? Why did they choose particularly overdraft fees? And I really think it was just the matter of someone noticed. Someone said, well, we reject these transactions. So before at the debit card, we would reject these transactions, and then we don't charge any fees for that. The person found out they don't have the money, so they walk away. Or we didn't let people's checks clear if they were overdrafts. So, some very, smart, creative person said, well, what happened if we start saying yes? Would people start to overdraft more? And what happens if maybe, we'll advertise it a little bit in the beginning, or we'll send someone a disclosure that says, we'll take the headaches out of your overdrafts. What will happen then? And what happens is their overdrafts increase by, hundreds of %. And the reason is, first of all, at your debit card, people think, well, the bank knows how much money I have, so if they're letting it go through, I must have the money in my account. And then there's also people who get caught in that cycle, and so it feeds on itself. So the business model is you let people overdraft, and then they'll have to overdraft more to make ends meet.
I can't get it out of my mind, Gaines. We're crooks.
You talk as if you're just finding that out.
Things are getting worse every year, simply because more people are being drawn into the debit system, where they don't even have protection if they suffer identity theft, for example, and it's just too automatic. Now, there's no doubt about it. The banking industry has realized that they can create profit centers, which is what they call them, in one area after another by nickel and diming consumers in large volume.
But Visa came up with a product called Signature Debit, which is nothing more than a credit card, but the money comes out of your bank account as opposed to a credit line, which you have with a credit card. And that product has been priced very high. It's been very successful. It's made a fortune for people, particularly these bigger banks. The 10 biggest banks have about 75% of the Signature Debit card volume. They have more than 90% of the credit card volume. So just a handful of guys are the ones making tens of billions of dollars of profit every year. It's a little bit like a narcotic, and some of the big bankers have said that in person before too, in conferences.
Wait a second. Did you hear what he just said? He said that the bankers have compared themselves to drug addicts, and their drug of choice? Free money from low-income Americans.
It's so nice to get all that high margin, basically free revenue and income right off the bat because people are making mistakes.
As I realized what I was doing exactly, I kind of felt the need to change my identity somewhat. So I started calling myself Benny the Collector.
Benny the Collector?
Yep. And there's a funny thing, like when I was Ben, somehow when I was Benny, like people seemed to respond to me a little differently.
Do you feel like it became sort of an alter ego a little bit?
Yeah, that was a need for me, because I just, after a while, I was not comfortable doing what I was doing, and I think that was just part of my way of making the cubicle a little more of an escape from reality. And I just felt like I was at the bottom of this elaborate pyramid scheme designed to extract money from people who didn't have it, to just funnel it up to the CEOs and the higher ups in the company. It was just, and I was part of it. And at the same time, like I'm a debtor, I was a debtor. I'm in debt now, like most people, and I felt like I was almost split in half. It was just, and you know what was interesting? Hurricane Katrina was a huge, because we had so many of these $1,000 loans. So many of those people had those loans, you would not believe it.
Oh, wow.
And
so you talk to people.
Well, there's a lot of government involvement actually about that. And but we know, aside from that, I was calling people, and I knew like they just experienced a hurricane. Plus, there were hurricanes in Florida that year too.
Yeah.
And they were telling me like, my house is gone. And I was like, what am I gonna say? I was like, what about that 38 plus the 15 late fee? And they're like, okay. Those are the conversations. It's just, and then I felt,
There was a banking consultant we interviewed in Grand Central Station in New York in December, and he said,
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that they've ratcheted the terms so that it's a lot harder to get out of it. I know I've experienced that myself.
Yeah, and I thought, Jesus, if the professionals are getting caught with these fees, what are the civilians like us supposed to do?
Exactly. That's actually well said. That's well said. Yeah, because it's you just need to be able to carve out time for that part of your life, that financial part of your life, and it didn't used to be so complicated.
The reason I'm here is because people that I interview keep using the word evil. They'll say, I feel like I'm part of this evil scheme, or I feel like the bank is treating me so poorly that it's evil, or, they'll just use that word.
Sure.
So my lawyer is a little bit concerned that we might get sued for using the word evil. Because evil, when you think of evil, you think of Hitler, you think of Stalin, you think of like these evil figures in history. And so I'm a little bit, I'm just kind of wondering if evil is something that makes sense, that we can actually apply in this situation. Are overdraft fees evil in some sense?
I think that there's a number of ways to think about evil, and historically we kind of connect evil with this idea of incredible harm, and also with this idea of intention, willfulness. And so when we think about something being evil, we think of there being a tremendous harmful occurrence, and then there's some sense in which that was intended to occur. Someone intended to inflict an incredible amount of damage on something else, typically humans, maybe the environment, what have you. Have we really, as individuals, been given a chance to make an informed choice? Do we understand the ramifications of our choice? And if you think of just an analogy from medical ethics, we would in no way imagine that a doctor would approach a patient with a very obscure document and telling them to just sign here, don't worry about the details, and things will be okay. That would be horrible. And we would want, for sure, that doctor to be making sure the person understands what the document contains, walking them through every section of it, and maybe even reading the document with them. And then lastly, making sure they understand the incredible ramifications of signing the document and going forward with a particular procedure or a particular treatment. Banks could be doing that with people as well, and I think they have an obligation to do that.
I used to be with Wells Fargo, now I'm with US Bank due to overdraft charges. The bank would always take the larger amounts first when they were the ones that were the last ones paid, and all the other small fees were taken out last, which were charged before the larger one hit. So I would get dinged every time for a $5 or a $7 deal, $33, and I'd have 5 or 6 of those, and just times $33 times 7, that's quite a bit of money that could be in my bank account instead of paying the bank. They said, you know, it's my fault for not taking care of my financial business, and that was the reason why I switched.
And do you have any recommendations in terms of, you know, credit unions versus banks, small bank? Are you kind of saying the smaller the bank, the smaller the institution, the better?
Yeah, I prefer a smaller bank. There's a labor-owned bank, Amalgamated Bank in New York, with a branch in Washington. There's the Wainwright Bank in Boston area. It's an excellent small bank. There's the Shore Bank in Chicago, which is an excellent bank that has pioneered low-income housing loans in poor areas in Chicago successfully. And there are some good credit unions. The bigger credit unions are becoming more like commercial banks, but there are still some good credit unions. So you still have some opportunities.
How do you do your own banking to avoid, you know, getting messed with by the banks?
Simplify, simplify, simplify. I do not have a debit account. I do not have a credit card. I do not have payment electronically. I reduce the number of checks that I write as much as possible. I let the bank know that they have my business only contingently, and I explain to them why I prefer a cash economy. For many years, I have urged a cash discount for cash payers, because when you pay a retailer cash, that retailer gets the entire money. When you pay by credit card, there are all kinds of commissions and fees that take away some of that money from the retailer. So if you pay cash, you should get a discount. And the only way that's going to be done is to sign up retailers who agree with that and who are willing to encourage people to pay by cash. Because when you pay by cash, you're less likely to engage in impulsive buying. Number two, you're less likely to have your privacy invaded. Once you get into the credit card economy, they know everything about your purchasing habits. They can draw profiles on you. They can send it anywhere in the world to your detriment.
Yeah, in a sense, you do it sort of the old-fashioned way. Take money out of the bank as you need it, spend cash. The
hazard here is that increasingly the companies are coercing customers into the credit and debit economy. For example, try renting a car without a credit card. And the reason why they want you in the credit and debit economy, other than they can hit you with all kinds of fees and charges and penalties, is that they can intimidate you into not complaining. Because people all over the country know that if they complain to their car dealer too strenuously, after a while the car salesperson is going to say, you know, if you keep this up, you're going to damage your credit rating. Well, now it's even worse, because they say you're going to raise your credit score, which is like an iron collar on around the throat of consumers in this country. So just opt out if you can. Opt out.
How do you do your banking, you personally? Like, since you know this whole ugly landscape that's out there, what choice have you made?
I'll start with organizationally.
Okay.
So our organization does its banking at two different places. One is a community development bank. That's another institution that exists, and they don't have them in every city or in every town, but we have one in New York called Community Capital Bank, and all of its loans, every dollar that goes on deposit that's lent out is lent out for community development purposes, period. Now, this bank, which we've been championing, was just bought by Carver a few months ago.
And Carver's a big national bank?
Carver is a New York bank. It's a black-owned bank in New York, which doesn't have the best track record in its lending, so we'll see where that goes. We were happier when Community Capital was an independent bank, but we also bank at the Lower East Side People's Federal Credit Union, which is one of these community development credit unions that I've been talking about, which has just expanded beyond the Lower East Side to Harlem, to central Harlem, so it now covers a greater swath of the city. And then personally, I've sort of struggled with this. I used to bank also at Community Capital Bank, but there's only one branch. Okay. So I bank at a bank in my neighborhood.
Okay.
Where I live.
Like a national bank?
Like a Federal Thrift.
Federal Thrift, wow.
Not Washington Mutual.
Of course, if you're looking into changing your bank, there is another alternative. I was curious to find out what the rates were like on the street. What's the difference between borrowing from you versus borrowing from the bank, and do people ever talk about that?
The biggest difference, yes, they almost always talk about it. The biggest thing is that bad credit. Their credit's bad, or they have a bad relationship with the bank or the banking institutes themselves or credit unions, and they just can't borrow the money. Plus, that's a process. Like I said, some of the people I borrow the money to, if they had till tomorrow to make a decision, they probably make a different decision. But then there's like people who work every day, like blue collar people who just have to pay like 2 mortgages at one time type thing. So they need like 3 Gs, and they're working. So it's like a point and a half, because they have family and trying to take care of their house. It's not like a gambling thing, you know what I mean? So it's a different kind of, I have more empathy with a person who works. And, as far as, if they don't pay the debt, the consequences usually the same for everyone.
You have an advantage. I think when you walk into a bank, they probably know they know that they can't mess with you, or you'll take your business elsewhere.
Well, you'd be surprised how many times they do, because it's all computerized, so they don't know who they're dealing with. So when you complain, they say, "I'm sorry, that's just a computer program." I said, "Well, humanize it and delete the charge."
For myself, I chose Albina Community Bank. Their overdraft fee is still higher than I would like, but they let you opt out of the program up front. In the year I spent talking to people about their banks in Portland, I never heard a single complaint about this bank, which I found so freakish that I had to open an account there. Plus, they're a community development bank, which means their charter requires them to support the local community. About this time, I heard some good news from California. A man named Paul Miller had started a class action lawsuit against Bank of America. I went down to San Francisco to talk to Paul and his lawyers.
At the time this thing with the bank happened, I was progressing, getting out of my problem a little at times, but when that came down with the bank, it was like, put me down on the ground, it's like, well, now you're totally in debt, you have no money, it's like the bank was squashing on me, and it's like, I'm not the only person. It's like, there's senior citizens. There are a lot of people it's a borderline, and if a bank comes down on them, which is a national institution, it's like, what can they do? What's life for? It's like.
Universally, the bank employees testified that they did exactly what we alleged that they were doing with respect to Paul Miller and others, that they seized exempt Social Security and other public benefits from any account that they had access to, and that they did that knowing full well that the conduct was illegal, and that if pressed by people like Paul Miller or others, that they would reverse the charges and restore the money to them. The jury awarded $75 million, and then, because of a provision of California law, they awarded each member of the class from whom exempt funds were taken the amount of $1,000, which in the aggregate in this case, if you total that out, that's more than $1 billion for the class. The trial judge then issued a permanent injunction preventing the bank both from misrepresenting that it had a right to collect this money and from collecting the money in the future. In November of last year, an intermediate California Court of Appeal reversed the jury verdict and the trial court's decision, but last Wednesday, on March 21st, the California Supreme Court decided to review the case and is likely to hear the case and decide the case next year in 2008. If we had tried this case in the 70s, the 1970s as opposed to 2004, I have every reason to believe, based on experience, that the federal government, the United States government, would have been on the side of the customers in this case, of the elderly and the disabled. It would not have been on the side of Bank of America, which is the second largest financial institution in the world. In the old days, national banks and other lenders were profitable, but not at the same rate and the same amount as banks have become accustomed to beginning in the late 80s and, and increasing to this point of time. And that's true with respect to checking accounts, lending products, credit card accounts, automobile loans, basically across the board into this whole variety of financial services. And I think it's going to become a matter of national public policy for the Congress and the President to say, enough is enough.
It's us, so which corner you integration's never had us feeling so good, and we'll make lots of money. Forever I can sing about trusting and teamwork and doing the right thing. We'll live out our core values while the competition crawls, 'cause they want what we have got, but it's only here at Bank of America. One bank, one card.
Hace un tiempo yo era madre soltera y tenía una cuenta con US Bank y tenía un trabajo bueno, pero me pasaba algo que en veces por no tener el cuidado suficiente y mantener escrito todas mis transacciones que hacía, había unas veces que yo recibía por correo avisos que tenía sobregiros en mi cuenta y me estaban cobrando $35 por cada sobregiro. Y esos $35 a mí me causaba mucho problema porque era dinero que yo no tenía y que tenía que conseguirlo para pagarlo. Ese dinero me podía haber ayudado a mí a comprar tal vez más comida o un par de zapatos a mis hijos que siendo madre soltera es muy difícil hacerlo. No sé, no.
Banks hardly ever lose in Congress. It's hard to remember the last time they lost anything because they're so powerful. And they hire the retiring congressional staff who become their lobbyists. They pour money through their PACs into members of Congress. They offer retiring members of Congress sometimes jobs in the banking industry. They're very powerful. But there's no one more powerful than people once they get organized. Nobody can beat the people when they're organized. And people have to realize that every time they complain, they're contributing to a stream of dissent and a stream of pressure on these banking industries. Every time they contact their member of Congress, they're doing their part. And every time they demand the restoration of the usury laws, which were largely repealed at the state level in the 1970s due to the bank lobbying, they are moving toward almost a biblical standard of controlling outrageous interest rates that go up to 300, 400, 600, 700% at times, not just on payday loans.
So far, our Federal Reserve System is, stayed at arm's length from this. At least the senior guys do, but all the middle managers I talk to at the Fed say, no, this is where we need to get in and make sure there's a level playing field for people that give consumers a chance to get the services they need from any financial institution they want. And if the Fed can do that, if Congress can nudge the industry along in that direction, I think you'll see plenty, thousands of financial institutions with a better value proposition. And ultimately, the big guys are going to have to respond to that.
I'm always optimistic about the future because pessimism has no function. But the optimism rests on a widely perceived sense of injustice by a lot of consumers of financial services, number one. That is, they know it. The second is this idea of an insert in the bank statement. It doesn't have to be every month. It could be 4 times a year, where you open your bank statement and this little coupon comes out and says, do you want to band together with others to help with your complaints, to help with fairness in banking? Send $10 dues and you'll be part of this powerful state organization. And that's the best thing that the regulatory agencies can do.
There is actually a bill in Congress right now that will address the problem, called the Consumer Overdraft Protection Fair Practices Act. While I was in Washington, I went to talk to the bill's sponsor, Representative Maloney from New York.
But this protection comes at a hefty price. Oftentimes the hidden bank fee for overdraft is higher than what the customer spent overdrawing their account. And truly, in basic fairness, we should allow customers to decide whether or not they want this protection, whether or not they want to pay this fee. It's very unfair to impose it on them when they don't even know about it. But I believe we will achieve it because it's only fair that people know what's in their bank account. It's only fair that people sign up for services if they want them. And it's only fair that fees be disclosed to customers so that they know what's ahead of them. There has not been a hearing on my bill. It has not been reported out of subcommittee. We are going into new Democratic leadership in this next Congress, and I will be chairing the Financial Institutions Subcommittee. I can assure you there will be a hearing on this bill in a Democratic Congress.
The story of Henry Ford and the Dodge brothers, it was a legal case. It was decided by the Superior Court in Michigan in 1916. The Ford case is interesting because what it does is it kind of consolidates an evolution in corporate law towards this principle that corporations always have to serve their own self-interest. Ford set up his company to make cars, and the Dodge brothers, who went on to start their own company, Dodge Cars, the Dodge brothers were major investors in Ford's company. They put, I think, $10,500 into it, which was a lot at that time. And Ford was paying out a dividend to his investors. And one year he decided he was going to cancel that dividend because instead of paying out the dividend, he wanted to reduce the price of his Model T cars. And so he canceled the dividend, and the Dodge brothers took him to court. And he went to court, and he said to the judge, in effect, yeah, I'm in the business to make money for my shareholders, but I'm also in the business to help out consumers. And I'm also in the business to help out my workers. So I'm going to pay them more than other people are paying them. I'm going to charge my consumers less for my cars than other people are charging them, because I want to help all of these different groups of people in society. His mistake was to stand up in court and say, I'm not just trying to serve my shareholders, I'm trying to serve other groups. And the judge said back to him and decided in favor of the Dodge brothers. He said, you can't do that. Corporate law requires that you only serve the interests of your corporation and its owners. You do not have the authority, you don't have the legal authority to decide that you want to help anybody else out. And so that kind of really consolidated this notion in US corporate law that the corporation always had to act in its own self-interest, i.e. in the interest of those who compose it, which are the shareholders.
That's kind of terrifying. I mean, what you're saying is that corporations aren't doing all of these evil things because they can. Corporations are doing all these evil things because they're required to by law.
That is the terrifying aspect of the corporation and of corporate law. It's that it's not really, the problem isn't really with the directors or the managers or even the shareholders. It's with the structure that we've created as a society that says we're going to require this institution always to serve its own self-interest, even if that means trampling other people's self-interest, not taking account of other people's manipulating other people, destroying the environment. That we are required by law to do this in order to fulfill our legal obligations. And so that's why I think it is sometimes dangerous to vilify the managers and directors of corporations as the source of the problem. If we focus too much on that, then we divert our attention from what I think is the real problem, and that is the legal structure that we as a society have created in this thing.
Loans were sealed with a handshake. You know, it was more of a personal level sort of banking experience that people had. And over time that changed to where, you know, everyone's a number now, and they don't know who you are. They just want to maximize their income from each customer, if you think that's fair. But what do you think?
Well, it's important to figure out who the they is, because it's easy enough to blame the corporate execs. I mean, there's plenty to blame.
Sure.
But unfortunately, you have to really look at the shareholders too.
Okay.
And that's increasingly all of us.
Right.
And so I have this vision of us eating our own tail. You know, on the one hand, we want prices to be low, we want things to be affordable. On the other hand, many of us now have, through 401ks and other retirement vehicles, since there isn't any more real retirement fund, we're invested. And so we want these stocks to go up. So who's at fault here?
When you're talking about corporate power and you're talking about who's in control, you know, there's a really famous, I believe it's a Noam Chomsky quote, but he's talking about how humans aren't even really in control anymore, because the profit motive itself, the stock market itself, has its own power. And if somebody at the head of one of these big corporations that's not treating its customers very well, you know, grew a conscience overnight and then the next morning said, you know what, we're going to stop doing this, they would get fired, and they would be replaced by somebody who's willing to do it.
Yeah, greed is a huge factor in our culture. And when I say our culture, that isn't even limited anymore to our country, because we're not in a national economy. On the other hand, I think there's a risk of simply saying, well, it's clearly too complex and too global to address. And I don't really believe that's true. I think that people can make a difference. And I think it's always important to remember that when you're unhappy with something, don't start with the clerk in your local bank. Write a letter to the CEO. Personal letters do get attention.
Politics in America is just a big football game. Rah, 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 go Democrats, go Republicans, nothing really changes. And so for me, I think one thing that I've come to realize is, like, I need to give $35 a year to, you know, the Center for Responsible Lending, or, you know, any of a number of consumer advocate groups, or MoveOn.org, or anyone like that who's actually trying to change the way politics works.
Yeah, and I think this is a very common feeling these days, is that what we should do is put our energy into civil society organizations or NGOs, non-governmental organizations, rather than into the official large P political process. And I guess what I would say to that is I think we need to do both. As things currently stand, the large P political organizations constitute the state and constitute state power, and thereby constitute economic power like corporations and property rights, and constitute the possibility for curbing the negative effects of those powers through labor protections, etc. But needless to say, that large P political process isn't going to be effective unless there is a very active civil society, unless there are people in organizations, people in the streets, people on strike, people saying, this is what we need, this is what we want, and saying it not just as individual consumers, you know, I'll buy from this gas station instead of that, but saying it as citizens, and as citizens who are organized with other citizens and acting through collective means.
Really see it as a pyramid scheme. Just made me just see it as totally evil, just pure and simple. And that the folks who are actually perpetuating the evil at the top of this company are so removed and have removed themselves so much from the reality of what's actually happening and where this money is actually coming from. It's coming from somewhere. It's coming from people who don't have it.
Right.
And it just, you know, and I was making money. I made a year's income off that too.
Yeah.
And I mean,
and you feel guilty about
that's there. That's always in my thing. And I, you know, it became so evil to me. I couldn't be part of it, and I'm still amazed I was able to do it. To have this conversation that I'm sorry for your loss. Please send the death certificate to, and I give him the address.
Please send the death certificate.
Yeah.
To
send a
prove
copy of
that
that. Is the Xerox okay? Yeah, Xerox. You can fax it. You want to fax it? Sure, no problem.
Just to prove that they're dead.
Basically.
And then you go after the estate.
Yeah, and I'd also ask, who's the executor of the estate? I'm sorry for your loss. Who's the executor of the estate? of your mother's estate. Those are the times I was like, oh, wow, how far I've fallen somehow, or I don't know.
Wow. What are you going to do for penance to make up for this job?
I'm doing it.
Anything that consumers can do themselves, perhaps, to make the situation better?
Oh, there are a lot of things. Just an individual consumer, get to know one of the tellers personally, if you can. Yeah. Number two, know your rights. The FDIC has a very good consumer newsletter, which shows you your rights. Number three, be a talker. When you let the bank know that you're going to be a talker, when you walk out of that bank and you're mistreated, you're not the only one who's going to know about it. So then you become known that way. You become known as someone who cannot be pushed around. I know a lot of forceful consumers who, if, for example, they get a bounce check penalty, they call up the bank and they say, look, I don't want you to do this. You know, this isn't the way. I've been a long-time customer. Get rid of it. And very often they get rid of it because the banks don't want the hassle. They don't want a possibility of a small claims court or a class action.
I've heard that before from a few other people. Do you think taking your bank to small claims court, even if it's Bank of America or Washington Mutual, can that work?
That's the best remedy you could ever have, because you don't need a lawyer. You walk down, they show you exactly how to use the small claims court. And if you get a judgment and they don't defend it, you know, they're going to be in trouble.
And I suppose on a small thing like that, they figure it's not worth defending, so they don't even get, you know, send anyone to defend themselves.
At times that's the case, but even if they do, what are they going to defend? You know, it's usually a pretty outrageous abuse that requires a small claims by a consumer.
Yeah. So I went out to test Nader's advice. The first step was to open a new checking account, even though that was the last thing I felt like doing after everything I'd learned. I chose Wells Fargo because I'd heard so many bad stories about them in the course of making the film. The next step was to get overdrawn. I thought as long as I was going to go into the red on purpose, I might as well really go for it. Ever since this film project started months ago, I've been getting emails from people with overdraft stories, and some of them are just insane. Hundreds and hundreds of dollars a month people sometimes spend on overdraft charges. So what I decided to do is test the limit of the insanity. I opened a Wells Fargo account. It's hovering near zero right now. It's a Saturday, so it's not even a banking day. And I'm going to go into this mall behind me, and I'm going to see how many overdraft charges I can get with this card. What better place to test the insanity of the consumer society that we live in than a mall? That didn't work out quite as I had planned, probably because my account had only been open for a month or so. But I still got 3 fairly ridiculous overdraft fees. I called the 800 number to try to get them back, but we all know how well that works.
For a banker, press 0.
I got some overdraft fees that I wasn't very happy about. I was wondering if I can get them removed.
Okay, would you be willing to hold for me real quick?
Sure.
Okay, first, and then you get an overdraft fee or returned item, then...
Yeah, I mean, what I've been told before, is that it could be something really important, like my mortgage check or my rent or something like that, right?
Correct.
And that's why you do the largest ones first. But the largest one in this instance is like $23. Nobody has a $23 mortgage. Okay, so your answer is you can't give those charges back because you don't reverse overdraft fees unless it's a bank error. Is that right?
That's correct, yes, sir.
Okay, thank you so much.
You're welcome, Mr.
Bye-bye. The first step is to do a little research on the internet about how to file a claim. Next stop was the courthouse, where you fill out a few forms and pay a filing fee that's about half again as much as an overdraft fee. Then it's a quick trip to the post office where you mail a notice to the company's registered agent in your state. Took less than an hour to take a major corporation to small claims court, and now I just wait to see what happens. Either they're going to contact me and try to settle, or I'm going to see them in small claims court.
You know, banks have been around for 2,000 years. Banking is one of the oldest industries in the world, oldest professions. We joke about that. Yeah, and you know what the other oldest profession is. Well, banks were there. And banks provided a social function when you had isolated communities. The most trusted, the most honest person became the banker because people were actually leaving money with them. And then that person would be the person who would accumulate enough that they could actually go out and build houses or build railroads or whatever. So they were filling this intermediate function. And as more and more options come up on the internet, I mean, there's now ways to lend directly to small businesses as an individual, and it can be underwritten and you can be part of a syndicate that will lend, you know, somebody will say, I've got this business idea, I need, microlending. Well, once that model gets the bugs worked out of it, it's going to get bigger and bigger and bigger, and then why do you need banks?
We were on our way to an interview when the call came in from Wells Fargo. Okay, thanks for holding. I was driving and I had to pull over. Right. Okay, and what did you guys decide to do about it? Really? All of them? And what about the sustained overdraft fees that you guys have been charging me all week? Are you going to give those back as well? And then, I don't know if you know this, but it costs $47.50 to file in small claims court. Were you going to go ahead and give me that as well? Wow. Okay, well, thank you very much. And oh no, no problem at all. Go ahead and close it. Okay, you too. They're giving them all back. I can't believe it. The Wells Fargo district manager confirmed our suspicions. It was a simple business decision. It was cheaper to give me back my fees than to pay someone to defend the bank in court. They gave me my overdraft fees back, and then I got a hold of the district manager who made that decision, and she said that in 31 years in the banking industry, she had never heard of anyone bringing their bank to small claims court before. And I just thought, wow, you know, here's this thing that we all have access to, small claims court. It's based on common sense and fairness. Why don't people use it more often? And it made me kind of sad because it makes me think that people out there, the masses of people out there, just feel like they have no power. How can I take Wells Fargo to court? You can take Wells Fargo to court, but you don't even know about it, or you feel like you would never win.
We're taught to be powerless. We learn to be powerless, and there's a huge machine that is teaching us to be powerless, whether by design or by structure. The way that the mass media operates, the way that our education system operates, the way that basically all the channels of knowledge production and communication operate is to teach us to be passive, politically passive, to teach us not to be the very thing that the founders of this nation and other democratic nations put their lives on the line for, which is to be active citizens. That is the one thing we're not supposed to be. We're trained to be consumers, and what's happened, I believe, is that to the extent that people are progressive today, they see their only power as consumers, and you know, if I buy this or if I buy that. And the very dangerous thing about that is a consumer is a very individualistic kind of person, by definition almost. It's a person who decides, what do I want? What do I need? It's antithetical to the idea of organizing. I mean, yes, sometimes you have boycotts and whatnot, but essentially the idea of consumer is the person sitting alone and figuring out, how can I satisfy my needs and my wants? And so I think that at a very sort of large level is part of the reason we feel so powerless. It's because we've lost our sense of responsibility and of entitlement to be citizens. And so if all we are is consumers, if all we can do is act as these individual consumers, of course we're going to feel powerless because we're up against entities that aren't individual consumers. They're huge organizations and they're huge collective entities. And so here we are, the individual against the collective entity. What we need to do is start to, I think, reinvigorate our sense of acting collectively against these institutions. And because we do have power as citizens. Legally, technically, constitutionally, we have a lot of power, actually, as citizens. But we're trained to believe we don't, and we're trained not to use it.
There is one other solution to this problem that a lot of people don't think about, and it's really fast and really easy. I've got my bank's 800 customer service number on hold right here, so watch this. Yeah, I'm back. Yeah, I want you guys to take me off of your overdraft protection program. I found out that it's actually costing me a lot of money. That'll do it. Yep, thanks a lot. From now on, when I try to use my card and there's no money left in my account, my card's just going to get declined, which if you really think about it, is the way it should always work. If you really want to see a consumer revolution against the banks in action, you have to go overseas.
I'd read this article that had suggested that these bank charges may not be legal, and I threatened my bank. I added up all the charges I had, added on interest, and I wrote to them and said I want it all back or I'm going to take you to court. But it was before it was kind of publicised, you know, so it was a bit, you know, my wife was thinking, oh, hang on a minute, this is a large bank you're taking on, you might get done in, you know. So I was about amazed when they just settled. It came to about £3,300. It's a lot of money, you know. And Mark Gander had just literally a week or two before started the Consumer Action Group, or the Bank Action Group as it was at the time.
And I got involved in the bank charges campaign because I was seeing what bank charges were doing to my community. And really that was making people homeless, that was putting people into situations that they were so desperate that they were looking at suicide. And I received emails from like single parents saying, this week I had all my wages taken from bank charges. You know, I'm a single father with 2 young children. I had nothing to eat, couldn't feed the children. People are being forced into absolute poverty. And ultimately homelessness because of bank charges.
Is he a friend of yours? The devil he is. I hate money lenders, especially that one. But he collects twice as much as he lends, and those that can't pay, his friend the sheriff arrests them. Excellent, he's our man.
I mean, Mark's always said that he, at the time, it was set up for a bit of kind of fist shaking and, you know, to kind of shout at the banks, and, you know, a couple of hundred members, maybe nobody ever anticipated as of July 2008, it's sitting at nearly 190,000 members.
If the money lender collected double, then half his money belongs to the victims. We better make haste, this is a long list.
I written off all the templates when I first joined, and you got the standard reply back that we've done nothing wrong and we won't be returning any money back, and I thought that was the end of it for me, you know. I thought, oh, well, that's me, I'm beat, you know, there's nothing I can do, I'm one of the unlucky ones. It's not until you actually spend a little bit more time in it and speak to others at HINCAG that makes it common knowledge that this is quite typical of them, and you've got to pursue them. If it means getting to the court, then that's the way to do it.
It's always been about people helping others, you know, and this idea that people feel very isolated when they get a really nasty letter from the bank. It's isolating for people, it's frightening for them, but actually you come on our website and you see that actually there's 200 other people with an identical word-for-word letter, and they'll tell you, oh, and the next thing that's going to happen is this, because they've all seen it before. And it was amazingly empowering for people
Are you on the moneylenders list?
Yes.
What's your name?
Hugh at the Wood. I borrowed 3 marks last winter.
What did you pay back?
6.
Give him back 3 marks.
Following a bank judgment that went against a customer, the judges in England started to strike out all of the bank charge cases as not having any merit. We then put together a defence to that, and to do that we had to get the terms and conditions from a number of different banks going back several years. A call went out across the UK using the internet, using these groups, the Consumer Action Group and so on, and people then went and searched through their house to find the old terms and conditions from the banks, scanned them in, sent them to people like me, and within a matter of days we had a complete set of records of all the bank's terms and conditions going back 6 years. I mean, it's incredible. So we then were able to build the case, and before you know it, we're taking on the banks in the UK. They've got their legal team, we've got our legal team, and we beat them.
While I was in Scotland, I had a chance to interview a reporter who spent months working undercover at Barclays, one of the largest banks in the world, on assignment for the BBC.
I started work in the call centre in Newcastle, and I worked in the call centre for I think 2.5, 3 months. I then transferred to a bank and became a personal banker, and I was a personal banker for about 6 weeks, 6 to 8 weeks. And during the course that, which meant I dealt with all sides of customer service, so I dealt with them on the phone in Newcastle, and then I dealt with them face to face in the branch. What I wanted to find out was how the bank treated their customers and what they were interested in getting out of the customers. What I did find was an environment that was completely sales driven, and every customer was a potential sales target. There was a lot of pressure put on the staff to up their sales and meet sales targets constantly. When I spoke to a manager about this, and the manager said to me that when he started it was a customer service job hand in hand with a sales job, but now it was purely sales, and I don't know if that's to do with targets or sales lines or bottom lines or whatever, but that is the absolute focus now for the banks now. The culture that I found there was of just contempt for customers, and I fed that back to them, and they did say that they're going to look into it further. I've not been back to Barclays since then, so I don't know if they have.
With NatWest Bank was my main creditor, and I claimed back £6,200. At the same time, going back to 2002 when I had been having severe financial difficulties, I'd incurred charges on a Citi card from Citi Financial, and I took those to court as well. They took much longer, and I had to actually get the bailiffs into Citi Financial before they paid. Before they paid, even after a court order.
The banks here in the UK, they just kind of threw up their hands and gave you back your charges, but it was actually a US bank, Citibank, that was the nastiest one.
Yes. Yes, without a shadow of a doubt, yes. I mean, certainly the behaviour of their solicitors, and the way they wrote back to us, and the way they were prepared to take it as far as they possibly could just to prove a point, even down to coming up with contrived figures of how much it actually cost them to charge us.
We know from people that have worked in banks in the UK that the true costs to the banks of declining transactions is 50p or £1.50. So here were the banks making thousands upon thousands of percentage profit from effectively a nanosecond of computer time. Now, I remember going on to BBC Radio and debating this with the then chair of the British Bankers Association, Ian Mullen. He incredibly had the brass neck to say that yes, it was true, this was called the manual intervention. There was a human being sitting somewhere on a 24/7 basis, and when you went over your limit, they would open up your file and look through the file and say, should we pay this or not? And then, remarkably enough, they would say, no, we shouldn't pay it. And that would cost them £39. And I put the point to the Bankers Association, are you seriously expecting us to believe that with the millions of transactions that are taking place in the UK, that there's people sitting somewhere going through files of customers? It's an absolute nonsense. And it's computers. It's absolute, it's just dishonest. That was the bank's primary defence for a while, for at least a good year. And that was called the manual intervention defence. Would you believe it? They don't use that defence anymore. Because it's just absolute nonsense.
The banks just couldn't cope. They were being absolutely deluged with them. And the judges were having no sympathy with them because, of course, the bank would go back and say, look, we need a bit more time, we don't have the resources for this. And the judge would say, well, you made £12 billion profit last year, hire some temps. They were getting no sympathy.
In the year before the Office of Fair Trading got involved, the banks had given back something like £1 billion in the UK in the space of 12 months. And that was just from pure people power. So what I say is, if we can use people power to take on these big international institutions, we can win.
Fight the bullies. Don't let them tell you what you must do. After all, at the end of the day, their practice will be found to be unfair. But it's all about empowering people. If you can empower people to fight their cause, then the cause is there to be fought for. And it's a good thing.
Now don't forget that in today's world of mega corporations, all these companies on both sides of the Atlantic are completely intertwined.
Halifax Bank of Scotland, Royal Bank of Scotland, these banks own other banks in America. Other banks in America will have shares in the banks in the UK. It's a global business. The problems that we see in the UK with the banks are problems that you see in America, you see in Australia. This is an international, global problem. And it needs to be tackled, I think, by people in America, in Australia, in the UK, using their power as customers to say to the banks, I want my money back. And if you don't give me it back, I'm going to take you to court.
After everything that I've seen here in the United Kingdom, it's a little bit hard to want to go back to the States, where the banks still have the law on their side. What I'm hoping is going to happen is that I'm going to show what people have done here, and that'll inspire people to follow their example back in the US.
If 1 million consumers filed 1 million small claims court action a year against the banks would either try to abolish the small claims court or they would improve their performance.
It's like they're taxing people for not having money. It's just not right.
I have had endless problems with Washington Mutual, and when I was looking into other banks and questioning other people about their banks, everyone had similar horror stories.
I do need to have you get on the property.
So can I borrow $5,000 to finish my movie?
Sure.
Well, I don't know. I don't got any collateral, though, is my problem.
Yeah, it probably wouldn't be good for you to borrow.
The profit motive, which drove Futzy to accomplish so much, may bring out the evil as well as the good.
People get confused and think that corporations, like banks, are there to serve them and to do something good for them in the community. And that's a complete fallacy. Corporations, businesses, banks exist for only one reason: to make money. Period. To make profit and to maximize their profit. And so any opportunity they have to maximize their profit, they're going to do it. Whether it's through lobbying Congress in the Senate to create these loopholes so that they can basically suck more money out of working families' accounts. $25 a month is the difference between people being able to pay their power bill or not. Making a profit's okay, but we don't need to make obscene profits. We don't need to make profits so that it basically corporations and stockholders are getting rich at the expense of working people and their families and basically driving them into poverty. That's not the way it's supposed to work.